Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a really good pleasure for me to say a few words to get us started. I want to just focus my initial comments on the ACACIA project and exactly what it is we're trying to do, and give you a bit of the strength of the current history of how plant arrived on this at this point. We just situate the seminar today into that broader context. So the center sort of began to do some work about 3 years ago on the kind of linkages between issues of gender, inequality, and climate change. Flowing out of some initial work, we started to focus on work that made the link between climate change and care. For those of you who've been working in the field of feminist economics, I think you'll be quite familiar with the critique in feminist economics about the undervaluation of care. And the implications that has for investments that we make across the economy in social protection and on social infrastructure expenditure. So one point that's often made in that critique is that because we undervalue care, because it's largely done on an unpaid basis, and because there's a particular gender distribution to how that care work happens. We don't see it in the numbers, and therefore, when we allocate resources in, for example, a national treasury, we would under-allocate resources to those important parts of our economic system. We wanted to take those ideas, and we worked with a group of feminist economists to develop a conceptual framework that took those kind of ideas into science for climate change debates. And between Sonia Palazzi, Julia Taylor, and myself, we developed a conceptual framework to make those linkages, and we were extremely generously supported in that work by the IDRC. Flowing from that, the IDRC approached us to put in a proposal for an open call that they had put out to take the work from being largely conceptual, providing evidence for this link between care and opportunity. And we engaged, among others, with colleagues like Chevonne Reynolds and Sally Archibald from the School of Animal and Plant Studies at Wits, and colleagues at the Aga Khan University around. They're not hear us?
Yeah, because they can drop something.
Let's just check with technically better. Can I just check, can those online hear us?
Yes, we can hear Imran.
Except all.
So there seems to be a lot of echo from somewhere. I don't know where that is coming from. But anyway, just go ahead. No problem. You can pick a few pieces and bits.
Yeah, so we engaged with a number of colleagues at WITS and colleagues at the ACACIA University to develop a proposal to set up a network in Africa of researchers who are doing work in this field. So the ACACIA project, which we launched recently, is the building of this network of people who will be doing research on this on the care climate kind of issue, but really specifically to advance the conceptual work that had been done by providing an evidence base to some of them. One part of that program is a seminar program that we're going to be running over the duration of the project to just generate more research and evidence on this issue of the nexus between care and climate change. And we're really pleased to launch that seminar program with an input from KNI today. We're really pleased pleased to have with us. So with that, let me pass it on to Chevonne, who's going to run the procedure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Imran. I think I'll just introduce myself, because many of you won't know me. And I think that's a good thing. So I am Chevonne Reynolds. I'm an associate professor in the School of Animal, Plants and Environmental Sciences, the Faculty of Science here at WITS. And why I think it's a good thing that you don't know me at all is that we're talking about an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary project. So I'm coming from a deeply physical science, biological science background and engaging with the group here at SDIS to actually work on something that requires the conceptual thinking, the skills, the knowledge from multiple different domains. So it's very exciting that we actually get to no longer talk at each other or cross purposes, but to actually work together to build something that we think is potentially quite groundbreaking and have huge policy benefits. So I just want to take a little bit of a step back into the, I have a little slide, sorry, that has the infographic. So, okay, it's fine, I'll keep talking. Just take a little bit of a step back and how I've come to be so interested in care work is through the care climate conceptual framework, which Sonia and Julia and Imran put together. And they presented this at on multiple different platforms, but specifically at the climate change symposium that's held at WITS. And for me, there was something that was quite striking about it, and actually only emerges when you look at care through this climate lens, so at this nexus. And it's that all of these issues that we are facing actually would stem from this inability to care, or the fact that we haven't recognized, rewarded, or really thought about the importance of care. And from a biologist perspective and ecologist perspective, we are working, we are also doing care work. We just call it something different. We call it conservation, we call it stewardship. And when you start to see what's emerging in households or how you all traditionally may think about care, and we look at how the care work that's being done for the planet is equally as unrecognized in budgets. It's equally unremunerated. It's equally unrewarded. It's often ignored. these two things have like very, very deeply parallel. And together, they really result in the actual care climate crisis, right? So this stems from an inability to care for our planet and to not recognize how important it is to provide support to help us care for each other. So one of the conceptual components that ACACIA is aiming to address is evidence at this connection between the environment and people. So the project is sort of broken down into three main work packages, which are all then underpinned by policy impact, or policy impact. And the first thing we really want to do is try to build this hub. So we want to connect people who are working on care concepts, but not only care concepts, so working in the policy space in climate change, climate science, ecology, natural resource use, bring them all together to build a network and to speak again, not across purposes, but collaboratively and with each other. And so our website will serve as a primary platform for that. What we are also building is a Google Maps story. So as the hub grows, pulling in stories from all over the African continent, linking that to the map to really show where this work is happening, who's doing it, and how it's all related to each other. And then, of course, producing infographics and animations, which will go out and be more accessible to a general audience, again, hoping to pull people into the hub and to become part of a larger conversation. The second work package is really focused at the evidence interface of care and climate. And what we have, the approach that we've taken here is to use long-term health and demographic surveillance sites data, largely in rural areas. And the two data sets that we'll focus on today are the South African in Asian reports. We're lucky enough to work with Professor Wayne Klein, who has collected incredible household data over nearly 20 years in the Bushbuck-Ridge area. So we really have this deep understanding of household level use of natural resources, the direct and indirect effects of climate change, both on people and how difficult it is for them to maintain your livelihood, but also those indirect effects and how that's affecting your natural resources. So your access to water, grazing, elements potentially of like woody plant encroachment, for example. And then the other data set is in Kenya, which Anthony, our colleagues at Kaloleni-Rabai University, will give you a full insight into. And as part of the grant, we'll then call in additional data partners and hoping to then pull in another HDSS study, which kind of links between Kenya and South Africa. So we can have more evidence across different contexts. And then finally, we're looking at, so this is a very exploratory work package, it's quite exciting, is financing at the Care Climate Nexus. So there are various mechanisms that are available for funding climate change adaptation and mitigation, so things like carbon credits, for example. But some of the issues with these mechanisms is that they inherently reduce that complexity down to one little number, and it loses a lot of the context or the social context of what's happening. So what we're going to try and do in this work package is map the different financial mechanisms that are available to finance climate or climate financing, and then look to see which kinds of mechanisms would support a more caring approach. So both supporting social reproduction, but also reproduction of the environment. And so we are terming these care credits, and it's very exciting to be undertaking this exploratory approach, and we'll be inviting different colleagues from different backgrounds, and of course people working in the financial sector spaces. Then finally, obviously hoping to have some policy impact with all of this work. And really starting to map work policy at both national, regional, continental, and international levels. So looking for these places where care is the obvious mechanism to support the actual policy change. Yes, and with that, I'm going to hand over to Anthony, so we stay on time. And if you have any questions, if you would like to join the project, just want to know more, please reach out. We're kind of muddling through it together, but I think we are creating a bit of a groundswell from the perspectives. Okay, thanks.
So, okay, thank you, Chevonne. Can you hear me? Please confirm I am audible.
Yeah, we're hearing you, Anthony.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chevonne, and thank you, Imran, for organizing this meeting to launch ACACIA Hub, as well as first of the quarterly seminars. So I can start by introducing myself. I am Anthony Ngugi. I am a professor of epidemiology and population health. So my background is really heavily health focused. But what I would say is I have long-term engagement with Wits University from a very long time back when I was doing my PhD. I would say how many years that is. I did part of my work, my PhD work in Agincourt, and I've had collaborations with people in the School of Public Health since that time, more than a decade ago, and still continue, and very happy to start working with the SCIS and building this hub together. So at the Aga Khan University, I chair the Department of Population Health, and I'm also associate dean for research in the Medical College. And for the purposes of this project, ACACIA Hub, I'm the co-PI of the Kenya side. And I think my task here is to try and walk you through what we bring to the project as AKU. So I think as Chevonne very elaborately and very eloquently described, this hub sits at the intersection of two of the most urgent development challenges of our time. That is this intensifying burden of care work, as well as the accelerating crisis of climate change. And so for us from our end, in AKU, we have what we call a very long-standing longitudinal population observatory in one of the regions of Kenya, which is the coast, which we call Kaloleni-Rabai HDSS. It's similar to the Agincourt HDSS in the Mpumalanga region. And this platform provides household level data. It can provide ecologically embedded data that is not available in many parts of this East African region. Then we also have deep expertise in epidemiology and population health, and many of the research, many of the objectives that we'll be addressing will also have a slant towards the health side. Then we also do have established relations in Kenya's national climate landscape. And then for the purpose of this project, we'll also be producing all the outputs jointly with our colleagues at Wits University. So maybe to put our platform into context, say that we have HDSS covering about 24,000 households and then also actively following up more than 100,000 population on a longitudinal basis. So from the agreement that we have, the formalized signed agreement between Wits and AKU, from the outset, this project is designed as a co-execution between the two universities, with AKU being the East African intellectual anchor for the project. So this means joint participation for all of the hub objectives, producing all the outputs jointly, that is including peer-reviewed publications as well as cross-site country comparative report. It also means that we'll be coordinating the open call for additional longitudinal data sets across partners in both regions, that is East Africa and Southern Africa, as well as joint leadership of the quarterly research seminar series. So as I mentioned earlier, the centerpiece for our contribution as a KU, that is to the evidence generation piece, is our HDSS platform, which is a population observatory that we built and we continue to operate up to today. And my colleague who leads this platform is Dr. Vela, who is also part of this project, and she's on the call. I think a number of you have met her. And I am also, sorry, I forgot to say from the beginning, I was also joined by Dr. Rospela, who is my colleague running this platform. And then I also have our other colleague in the department, that is Jackie Mnyamari, who is an environmental health scientist. Will also be contributing to this project. So this platform is in the coast of Kenya, which is a predominantly rural and agricultural community that faces really significant climate vulnerability issues. And what makes it uniquely suited for this project is a combination of a number of features. For instance, a very genuine longitudinal design that tracks the same 100,000 plus households over the years. Then we also have other studies that have been nested in that platform that have captured data on food systems, nutrition, women's empowerment, alongside environmental interaction. Then the households can be spatially matched to climate and remote sensing data, which is going to be a key element of our analytical approach. And then through that, we're able to assign climate exposure variables, the level of the village to the level of the household, as the case may be. And then the platform is also able to capture a full care environment nexus, for instance, how crop production, how water management, how livestock farming, as well as resource use are embedded in everyday life and also shaped by climate vulnerability. So in terms of our analytical contribution, as I mentioned, this climate data matching, that's linking our household survey data to the spatial climate products from a variety of satellite and imagery data sources. For instance, giving us drought indices, temperature extremes, rainfall anomalies at a very granular level. And these are matched to the same households that we track on a longitudinal basis. Then the quantitative work use models to examine how climate vulnerability affects the time households spend on care activities such as child care, elder care, water collection, fuel gathering, food production. And this can actually also be disaggregated by to really granular level, gender, age, socioeconomic class, because all these data are available. Then again, there's the new time use survey module that we co-developed and we are co-deploying with the colleagues in South Africa, that is in both HDSSs, ours and in ACACIA. And this will also help us to strengthen comparability of findings between the two sites. And then there's the qualitative integration, which is focus group discussions that we capture traditional ecological knowledge and lived experiences of shifting care burdens. So having said that, I will be contributing across the range of all the project objectives. And just to conclude, is to say that ACACIA Hub being a really serious scientific undertaking, aspiring to change how care work is counted, valued, and financed in the context of climate change. We are bringing to this project, the long-term relationships with rural East African population. We have really a deep understanding of how climate variability will shapes everyday lives of women and households in the area in which we operate, that is in the coast of Kenya. And then we are committing to translating the evidence that we are going to be generating into policies that serve the most vulnerable population. So in all, we are really proud to be the East African anchor for this hub. We are committed to the science that we are going to produce together and to the partnerships. So the partnership with the Wits University, which continues to grow. Then we are committed to ensuring that the voices and the reality of Kenyan communities are a part of what this, are at the heart of what this project is going to produce. Thank you, and back to you, Chevonne.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm going to stand together. All right, I'm going to introduce our wonderful speaker. I don't think you can see me. I just wanted to get the bio. I have to come back. All right. Diana, are you online?
Yes, yeah. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your talk. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to read your bio for the audience. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so Diana Vela Almeida is an assistant professor at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University. She combines political ecology and feminist critical geography to study extra-activism, neoliberal environmentalism, and socio-environmental resistance. Her recent work examines, 1, how green capitalism within the energy transition agenda perpetuates colonial structures, and 2, the exploited and invisible reproductive labor that underpins the energy transition globally. And so today, we are looking very forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Especially thank you to Ida, Sonia, and Julia for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here and joining in the launch of the ACACIA Hub. So you asked me to prepare a presentation. Let me just share now. Is everybody able to see and hear me well? That's great. That's great. Thank you so much. Oh. Okay. So just so I know, how much time do I have for this presentation?
It's the seminar program ends at 2:30. So you actually have plenty of time, but I think it would be great if we can have some discussion and some time for questions.
Okay, perfect. I'll do my best to keep on time, but please do let me know if I'm extending too long. So for today, I want to present you a paper that we've been working with 2 colleagues of mine, Martina Careta and Ingrid Altamirano from Lund University. And this is a paper where we center the conversation on just energy transitions in regards to what it comes to reproductive labor. But for our conversation, what we're talking about is about care labor, right? Just that we use a specific theoretical framework that focuses on reproductive labor. And what I'm going to talk about is how we place reproductive labor in the value chain of critical raw materials that are needed for the green technologies that are being developed. So this paper specifically focuses on 2 cases of study that are connected to Chile and Sweden. But what we claim is that basically a conversation about accessing to critical raw materials for the energy transition happens everywhere. So I think in a lot of countries, especially primary producer countries of critical raw materials, this conversation and talking about what it means for reproductive labor, what it means for labor exploitation, is an important conversation. But as I said, I'm going to focus particularly in these two case studies. So I'll start by saying that the energy transition depends heavily on intensive resource extraction and the exploitation of both human labor and nature. And lithium in particular has become the preferred mineral for manufacturing next generation lithium-ion batteries for electric mobility that is focusing. And now what is even more worried that we see that there is a transference of the need of these critical raw materials for military industry, which is even more worrying to talk about, the role of exploited labor and degradation of nature. And so a lot of the literature that is coming of talking about and calling upon the justice calls for the energy transition have focused the attention on what is called the green extractivism. So it really gives attention to the impacts of this mineral extraction. So in this case, particularly, I focus on Antofagasta in Chile, because it's the second largest lithium mineral operation, and that is located in an Andean salar ecosystem that is inhabited by peasant and indigenous communities. But what we argue here is that a lot of the literature has focused on the places of extraction, but the socio-environmental impacts extend beyond these extraction sites to the manufacturing hubs along the critical raw materials, along the supply chain. So for instance, we need to pay attention about how it places also impacts on the processing, but also manufacturing hubs of these critical mineral chains. And for instance, electric mobility, for example, at the end of the critical raw materials for energy production of electric mobility, has placed an important popularity in Scandinavian countries due to government support for accessing electric cars. So in a way, they have been putting over the years a lot of attention and funding for developing one of Europe's largest lithium-ion battery manufacturer that was established in Skellefteå in Sweden, which is a small city experiencing currently major socio-environmental changes, including raising immigration and affordable housing and community displacement because of this new industry putting in place. And there are increasing concerns for demanding justice in the energy transition. As I said, particularly to pay attention on the resource extraction and the exploitation of both human labor and nature. So just to bring us back to the conversation of just transitions, and especially on what has been said in terms of labor, or what it means just transition in terms of labor policies. This is a concept that emerged in the 70s as a result of workers calling for protections facing the industrial closures or phase down of carbon intensity industries. And this has been a long-term commitment supported by the International Labour Organization and has been the result of, as I said, a call for moving away from harmful ecological practices while offering well-paid jobs and sustainable labor conditions to workers displaced by environmental regulations, but also because they would be affected by carbon phase out. However, we see that most literature on just transitions that are focusing on the effects on labor consider mainly the formal labor conditions of the industrial sectors, defending job creation of workers whose representation is normally male-dominated, because if you think about these industries, normally are male workers in the industry itself hired as workers. They are racially privileged because they are predominantly embedded with informal jobs and normally industries located in the global north. while less attention has been given to calls in relation to the gender dimensions of the just energy transition, the gender labor structuration of global commodity chains, and the material conditions for social reproduction in energy production, circulation, and manufacture, and even consumption, and how labor relations of exploitation have effects on gender inequalities and violences. So we ask, where is reproductive labor in the conversation of just energy transitions? So to tie it back to thinking about the energy transition, we depart from the position that industrial work is not possible without the reproductive labor often performed by underpaid, unskilled, and marginalized workers, especially poor, racialized women and migrants. I'll be showing that as well later in the cases that we studied. As I mentioned, studies pay really little attention to the articulation of out-of-the-market interdependencies that contribute to processes of capital accumulation at a global space. So what happened outside of these firms? And what are the interdependencies that are producing several dynamics of labor exploitation? Because we claim that an effective just transition goes beyond the greening of energy policies, but should prioritize social reproduction. So in centering social reproduction in our study, we also try to understand the spatial configurations of just transitions. As I said, we focus at both ends of the lithium and copper value chains, right? And the places of extraction and on the places of manufacture of these lithium-ion batteries for electric cars. And we have the objective to render visible the variegated forms of reproductive labor that sustain and ultimately subsidize, and this concept is important, they subsidize production across lithium and copper extraction sites in Antofagasta, Chile, and the manufacturing of lithium-ion batteries in Skellefteå, Sweden. And this paper particularly looks to contribute by proposing an analytical framework for mapping reproductive labor across the commodity chain. And as I said, this framework, it aims to be intended to analyze other places where these similar dynamics are happening. And we are also offering empirical grounded insights that address the persistence of exploitative labor relations, calling for a reconceptualization of justice in energy transition. So a little bit of what I mean by reproductive labor, and following basically social reproduction theory that will claim that reproductive labor sustains all forms of economy, sustains the global economy, and we understand reproductive labor as care and sustenance work, biological reproduction, social provisioning, reproduction of culture and worldviews, community and emotional support, but also care for nature. And the main point of social reproduction theory will be the rejection on the separation of the spheres of production from reproduction. Social reproduction theory will claim that both spheres, production and reproduction, are mutually interdependent. And particularly, Marxist feminist scholars maintain that reproductive labor reproduces labor power. So basically what they will say is that reproductive labor reproduces the worker as a commodity, and that challenges this idea that value can only be generated in industries or in the market, but they actually claim that value generation also happens among the diverse economic experiences in care work, domestic work, community work, because basically for labor power to be regenerated and replenished in a daily and intergenerational basis, for this labor to be reproductive, there needs to be processes of regeneration and replenishment that can also be considered as value generation, because they satisfy the conditions for production. And in this paper, particularly, we use the framework by Alessandra Mesadris on the value theory on inclusion that was inspired by Diane Elson's work on value theory of labor that emphasizes the centrality of all forms of labor, including wage and unwage labor, in the generation of all forms of value under capitalism. But she focuses particularly on reproductive labor as value generating. And Mesadris also draws on Jairus Banerjee's work on the diverse forms of exploitation to highlight how reproductive activities are subjected to the extraction of surplus labor, because exploitation is not only tied to wage labor, but it also happens in processes of extraction of surplus labor from petty commodity production, slave and free and bonded labor that are normally prevalent in colonial and post-colonial societies. So this is important because it allows us to examine labor exploitation in the global south, as labor often organizes through informal relations, securing cheapening of labor. So what I was saying before, that for us was important also to show how these interdependencies between production and reproduction are important in the claim that reproductive labor subsidize production within the energy transition. So we wanted to go beyond the rhetorical claim and actually use it to analytically prove this form of subsidy. So what we argue is that when value generated through reproductive labor is formally subsumed into industrial economies of the lithium and copper supply chain, this labor internalizes the social cost of reproduction of industrial labor, therefore subsidizing industrial production in the energy transition. But I'm assuming there is a lot of extraction. I'll be showing you in the cases that I'll present later. And we wanted to focus, as I said, in these two cases and the two ends of the lithium and copper value change, commodity change, and show that the energy transition entails an uneven spatial reorganization, reconfiguration of capital that transforms both labor and socio-ecological relations globally. But what we also want to claim is that despite the different geopolitical and economic contexts of these two countries, in the case of Chile and in the case of Sweden, so Chile, for example, one of the most neoliberal regimes in South America, Sweden being a welfare state, but even though the differences in these two countries, in the case of Antofagasta and Skellefteå and the development of these industries, these are closely connected as critical nodes in the energy transition, and I'll be showing that. So first, I want to talk a little bit of Antofagasta in Chile. So this is a region in the northern of Chile that hosts the world's largest copper mines and lies within the so-called lithium triangle at the border of the Argentina and Bolivia triangle. And this region produces over 50,000 tons of copper and 123,000 tons of lithium annually, with metals and minerals representing around 72% of Antofagasta gross production. And chemical processing and shipping are concentrated near the city of Antofagasta in a place that is called La Negra Industrial Zone, and they are close to the port of Mejillones. And so these industrial landscapes generate heavy dust, ash, chemical pollution that are contributing to a chronic public health crisis, including one of the highest cancer rates in Chile and severe impacts on children's health. And mining operations relied on because this is really an industrial production. These mining operations relied on large residential compounds hosting thousands of mining workers and subcontractors. And what we want to pay attention, especially in terms of reproductive labor, we wanted to pay attention to subcontracted services that cover mineral processing, securing access, for example, to food, to clean infrastructures, to security. So, and for example, for food provisioning and cleaning, they are provided by companies such as Sodexo and New Rest, which are multinational companies which frequently employ low-skilled and, in many cases, migrant workers. And these labor regimes typically follow 7x7 or 10x10. 10 works in, 10 works 10 days out, 10 days in, 10 days out, with a significant number of workers traveling an average of 1,200 kilometers between home and workplace, families absorbing the social costs of reproduction because relatives are providing the childcare of workers employed in these long shifts. And meanwhile, they increase industrialization and automatization of the industry is resulting also in fewer jobs filled by less skilled, lower paid, and precarious informal labor that is displacing local population into shanty towns. So despite these conditions, the promise of mining jobs attracts an influx of migrants from Bolivia, from Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, and this is producing a racialized forms of poverty and segregation. So informal economies frequently involving undocumented migrants that are around shanty towns or what is called campamentos, and the reproductive labor is increasingly performed by migrants, women who face precarious access to housing, to clean water, to healthcare, education, and childcare. So similar conditions we saw in Skellefteå in Sweden. So Skellefteå is a small northern Swedish town that has historically depended on mining and logging until the industry declined around the 90s, and therefore it caused depopulation and abandonment. But in 2017, Northvolt established Scandinavia's largest EV factory, battery factory there, and the company attracted around 10 million euros in investment, and by 2024 it employs around 3,000 workers from 120 countries. And the factory's rapid growth strained the city, so environmental permits were fast-tracked, and the sudden population influx had an impact on housing and schools and healthcare, and many workers were housed in barracks. They were transported to work and were largely isolated from local residents. And they experienced harsh conditions, hazardous work environments, and inadequate training, as well as social isolation that contributed to accidents, to depression, and even cases of suicide. And especially it was hard for non-European workers who also face barriers for family reunification, and spouses who did relocate often found themselves limited in low-skilled jobs despite their qualifications. Despite of all of this, Northvolt declared bankruptcy in last year, in 2025, after failing to meet production targets, and also because lack of promises of investment that was coming from Europe. And this fallout in Skellefteå was significant, so there were thousands of layoffs, there was population decline and a 20% drop in housing prices and unsold properties. And again, hinting out of how it is now these critical raw materials are being more and more connected to the military industry. A couple of months ago, it was a news came out that this project, the Northvolt project, was acquired by the American company Liften, that acquired all these assets, and they are starting to resume production in 2026. And this company is linked to military production. So very briefly, because I think I'm using a lot of time, for these two cases, we spent around 2 months in each in each case study. We did ethnographic observation, and we collected around 60 semi-structured interviews with workers, informal, contracted, subcontracted labor relations. We also talked with union representatives and women associations, and we tried to create a type of mapping of reproductive labor at these two ends of the commodity change. So basically, what we did methodologically is that we traced or we map these forms of labor that occur in the primary site. So whether it is the market spheres, the domestic sphere, the public or the community sphere, where this labor is happening, and the compensation structure in relation to production. So is this paid or unpaid labor? Is it formal or informal labor? And what we come up, and I'll show you in a bit, is this framework will show a map of the variegated forms of labor, but paying attention to reproductive labor. It identifies who performs reproductive labor across the industrial sectors and geographical locations, and it traces how reproductive labor in one sphere subsidizes production in another, thus revealing the value generated within reproductive labor chains that structurally contributes to broader patterns of exploitation. So in this table, what you'll see is how we identify the workers, the occupations, and the everyday practices sustaining the lithium and copper industries in Antofagasta and the battery manufacturing in Skellefteå. As I said, you'll see here on the top the different spheres in where this labor is located, and on the left, the forms of labor in terms of compensation structure. And maybe because of time, what I want you to focus is on the colors one. So for example, if we pay attention to the market, we have the workers that are directly connected to the mining or manufacturing industries, but where reproductive labor is happening is in the informal and subcontracted wage labor and informal labor that happens through subcontracted cleaning, subcontracted security, subcontracted food production, but also food stalls that happen outside of the offices or of the industries, street food vending, sex work, even informal commerce and daily labor. And the workers that are directly employed by these industries in the market sphere, they are only able to provide the services by lending or securing also the reproductive labor from other people around their family circles in the domestic sphere. So you'll see also the connection to childcare, to cooking, cleaning, laundry, elder care, emotional support, household management, that is normally unpaid labor, but also some form of formal wage labor through paid domestic workers for the ones that can afford to pay a nanny, for example, to take care of their children. And if we move to the next column, we see also how reproductive labor is securing the conditions for maintaining the social reproduction of these workers through education, healthcare, public administration, and securing labor security relations. And finally, in the community sphere, we'll see forms of unpaid labor that are normally connected to community action, collective action, and aid, nature care, that are securing and filling the gaps of the lack of provisioning, social provisioning that comes from the public sphere or even the private sphere. I'll be showing you. So what we did is that we traced the reproductive labor workers and how they receive, how the connection between these spheres allows them to generate a productive capacity, as well as that we show we map how reproductive labor, what type of reproductive labor they perform, but also what type of reproductive labor they receive. And building on this framework, we wanted to humanize these experiences, because what you'll see is only the table. So because of that, we decided to present 4 vignettes that illustrates how labor relations and working relations, everyday practices are interwoven across the market, the domestic, public, and community spheres. And we present the stories of 4 women whose experiences render reproductive labor visible across different spheres. These women work mainly in the mining and manufacturing as subcontractors for the mining and manufacturing industry. 2 of them are located in Chile and 2 of them are located in Sweden. I don't know how am I going with time, but if we have time. Okay, maybe if, sorry?
You're good on time.
Okay, perfect. I like maybe to read with you 2 of the vignettes of these of these women. I have 4. Maybe we can read 2 together, and then I'll proceed to do the analysis of these cases. So I'll introduce you the case of Carmen. This is a case of underpaid food provisioning for subcontracted lithium transportation. So Carmen is Bolivian, from Santa Cruz, and works as a kitchen assistant at a roadside food stall. Her job includes helping in the kitchen, serving customers, and cleaning. The food stall is located along the road from the San Pedro de Atacama to Antofagasta route, where truck drivers transport lithium. And she works 12 hours a day from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. together with 2 other workers. Carmen has done her job since the beginning of 2025 after a Bolivian friend saw an advertisement for the position in Calama. She's paid hourly and has no formal contract, benefits, or employment affiliation. Accommodation, food, and washing are provided by her employer. Carmen lives in a room set up next to the food stall. She describes her room as comfortable with enough space to keep her clothes. For 12 hours of work, she earns 25,000 Chilean pesos, which is around 25 euros per day. And although Carmen does not pay rent, her income is below the legal minimum wage in Chile. She stresses that extremely harsh living conditions at night, water freezes, and she has no choice but to bath with this cold water. This is not just for anyone, she says. Getting to and from the work is also very difficult. To leave, Carmen usually asks a truck driver to ride to the nearest city. Returning is the real challenge, since there is no public transport along the route. She often must walk under the burning sun until she reaches a place where she can catch a ride, and that walk makes her feel unsafe. Carmen regularly sends remittances to Bolivia for her 2 teenage children who live with her sister that takes care of them. Still, she worries about not being there for them, since she feels they need their mother. As a single parent, Carmen has raised them on her own since they were small. The children have never met their father, who disappeared. Carmen has not yet regularized her migration status, and she explains that her decisions to migrate were driven by precarious living conditions in Bolivia while in Chile. She has at least been able to make some extra money to send money home, and she hopes to get her paperwork in order to eventually work in a mining or subcontracted company on a 10 by 10 modality, where employment is more stable and her pay is better. I'll introduce you the case of Andrea from Peru. This is a case of intergenerational childcare in subcontracted security. Andrea is from Peru. She has been living in Antofagasta city for 20 years. She works for a subcontractor providing security service to SQM, which is the most important lithium company in Antofagasta, but she works for the lithium chemical plant. Her shifts run from 7x7, alternating between 1 week of day and 1 week of night shifts. She shares one of the hardest parts of the job is the exhausting schedule. For daily shifts, she wakes up at 4:40 a.m., takes the company bus at 5:50, works from 7 to 7 p.m., and does not get home until 8 p.m., leaving her little personal time and contributing to chronic fatigue. In 2024, her employer implemented massive layoffs justified by the falling price of lithium. Now each shift operates within about half of the security guards it once had, forcing Andrea and her colleagues to manage double the workload without any additional compensation. These schedules have deeply impacted her personal and professional life. For example, the environmental conditions in the chemical plants increase difficulties at work. So despite protective gear, Andrea often returns home covered in dust, and she has developed allergies to the dust, ash, and chemical exposure. Her wage is slightly above Chile's lithium salary, but insufficient to live decently in Antofagasta, which is one of the most expensive regions in Chile due to the high mining capital flows of the region. She lives in a legalized settlement with her partner and mother, and her mother's reproductive work at home is crucial as she takes care of Andrea's 2-year-old son, saving her childcare expenses that Andrea could not otherwise afford. Still, the company denied her maternal benefits. She told us that the 7x7 shifts make it difficult to bond with her son, as she is often too exhausted to engage. The constant change between day and night shifts disrupt her sleep, leading for her to depend on cigarettes, energy drinks, and sodas to stay awake. Such stressful conditions led Andrea to experience panic attacks. She's now on medication for anxiety and insomnia and on medical leave. She emphasizes that many of her coworkers face similar struggles due to long hours, poor working conditions, low pay, lack of work benefits, and growing mental health issues tied to precarious employment in Chile's extractive industries. And Andrea is starting to obtain a degree to improve her job opportunities, but her work schedule and childcare responsibilities limit her progress. What I wanted to say, perhaps it is important, you might be thinking, these are very precarious conditions for women. We didn't want to emphasize on the victimization of the precarious conditions, but most importantly, in the analysis that you show, as you'll see, we wanted to emphasize this as a structural problem, and we wanted to point responsibilities to the ones accountable for these structural labor conditions. Just because of time, maybe I'll skip the case of Ophelia, and these two women are in the case of Skellefteå in Sweden. Maybe I'll talk to Fariva and I'll go to the analysis. Let me introduce you to Fariva. She showed us a case of short-term paid labor in subcontracted cleaning. This is as I mentioned, this is in Sweden. Fariva sought asylum in Sweden more than a decade ago after fleeing from war-torn Somalia. She's a single mom with 3 children. She had not gone to school in her country, and it was proven extremely difficult for her to learn Swedish and integrate in Swedish society. She has partaken in several language courses for migrants, and through those, she was able to get a few internships to improve her language skills. However, most of the jobs, which were cleaning in a hotel and washing dishes in a restaurant, did not require her to speak with any other Swede. So basically, she was isolated in her work, and she was rather surrounded by other foreigners in her same situation. when Norval opened, she was able to land a position to clean offices through Sodexo. She made between 19,000 and 25,000 Swedish crowns, which is around 1,900 euros monthly. And she considered that a good paid as compared to what she was making before through the internships. However, this amount was hardly enough to sustain a family of 4. She worked 8-hour shifts, and also she worked during weekends to make extra money. And she was only able to do that because her sister was helping her with childcare. So she shared carrying out she shared that carrying out the work by herself and meeting coworkers only during half an hour coffee break. The only Swedish person that she spoke with was the manager that was giving her instructions and planning her shifts. No one else. During breaks, people tended to congregate according to the language they spoke, so she only talked to other 2 people, one those that have connected to her job. And after 5 months in Sodexo, Sodexo resigned her contract just before she could get a fixed position and unemployment benefits. And that has been known as a common practice by Sodexo, that they lay off workers before they can claim any unemployment benefit. She never understood the reason why she was dismissed. But as I said, she learned that it was rather common for cleaning personnel to be dismissed before reaching the 6-month rank. Finding new hires was always difficult. So taking into consideration these cases of these 4 women, we wanted to show the analytical power of the framework that allows us to trace the variegated labor interconnections and reveal what we call the reproductive labor chains. So, for example, let's take the case of Carmen, as I mentioned. She works in food provisioning that secures the nutrition for the lithium truck drivers that work for SQM, and that they are the ones responsible to transport the lithium from the chemical processing parts to eventually to the Chilean ports and eventually exported elsewhere. So taking into account Carmen's work, it only happens because her sister absorbs the social cost of reproduction, allowing Carmen to accept wages below subsistence because her children's reproductive labor, her children's reproductive costs are transferred to Bolivia. Extending this logic, we can say that her sister's reproductive labor in Bolivia ultimately is subsidizing Swedish battery manufacturing, and that is what we call the transnational domestic-to-market change. In the case of Andrea, her work in the security, in the subcontracted security company for SQM, that is securing the operations for the chemical plants, allows SQM operations in the lithium chemical plant and eventually secure the global lithium supply. But it only happens because of her mom unpaid childcare and domestic work, because Andrea's income is insufficient to live decently in Antofagasta, but she can accept a job where SQM subcontractors pays underpaid, because her mom absorbs childcare costs and household management. So while Andrea cannot adequately care for her child. So this is intergenerational extraction that occurs as the grandmother's unpaid labor subsidizes the mother's underpaid labor. And that is what we call intergenerational domestic to market chain. In the case of Ophelia, that I skipped, sorry about that. Ophelia is the spouse of a worker that and she provides the emotional and domestic labor to her husband that works in the management company of Norbold and runs operations in the factory for battery manufacturing. And Ophelia's emotional support prevents burnout of the husband even after he was laid off. Ophelia's unpaid emotional and domestic labor is subsidizing the company's lack of mental health and well-being support and extended working hours that he and other workers were having. Meanwhile, Ophelia's job aspirations are interrupted by following her husband's employment. That is what we call an spousal domestic to market change of subsidies. And finally, Fariba's experience that she has to work on weekends for subcontracted cleaning to secure the cleaning processes of Sodexo and that provides services for Norbold. And this could only happen because of her sister unpaid childcare, but also all the solidarity networks that are absorbing the gaps left by public integration programs in Sweden. So Fariba's experience suggests that the Swedish state's failure to integrate is offset by unpaid domestic and community labor, ultimately subsidizing Sodexo's cleaning operations for Norbold. That is what we call the domestic and community filling public gaps. And like Andrea and Carmen, Fariba cannot provide adequate care for her own children, creating an intergenerational care deficit that is transferred to other women across borders and generations. So by tracing how reproductive labor spans multiple spheres, simultaneously, what we want to do is to render visible the interconnected transnational and generational displacement of the social costs of reproduction towards exploited women at the outskirts of the market economy, and show how labor in one sphere subsidizes production in another across the industrial sectors and geographical spaces. So for instance, a manufactured electric battery containing lithium extracted via Carmen's underpaid labor process as a plan secured by Andrea's double workload that is assembled in a factory cleaned by Fariba's temporary job and at the same time sustained by the unpaid childcare from Carmen's sister, Andrea's mother, and Fariba's sister, and Ophelia's unpaid emotional labor. So these women experience, at the same time, we see how these women experience health deterioration with Carmen's harsh working conditions, for example, Andrea's anxieties and contamination, Fariba's social isolation, and Ophelia's mental burden. And what we see is that their bodies are absorbing the reproductive costs that production externalizes, and when their bodies break down, they are basically replaced. So finally, and just to start closing this analysis, the framework renders visible the structural position that determines who performs which reproductive labor, and this reveals the uneven gender division of reproductive responsibility and where the state places minimal provisions. So what we see also is that in both in Sweden and Chile, weak public provisioning forces reproductive labor into domestic and community spheres. And this system operates on the assumption that women will absorb all the social costs of reproduction, and when they do not, they cannot, those costs fall on other women or simply go unmet. And this constitutes part of a social reproduction crisis whose deficits ultimately render the entire system unsustainable. And this is particularly important for manufacturing companies in Europe, whose green policies is built on global value transfer from extraction to manufacture, so from critical raw materials extraction to manufacture, because they are complicit in the exploitation of these women. And these are not incidental, but structural connected injustices that create a crisis of social reproduction with health insecurity, job precarity, and worker displacement in both geographies across the lithium and copper supply chain. So overall, I believe that these four chains illustrate green colonialism that externalizes the precarious, the dirty, the dangerous reproductive work of racialized migrants from the global south while claiming green and sustainable jobs in the global north. And finally, what is important for us is how then this conversation can bring us back to understanding or reframing or redefining what we understand by justice in energy transitions. Because what we saw is the variegated forms of labor exploitation and precarity and how they coexist, and how the energy transition is built upon gender, racialized, and class-based hierarchies that extract labor from reproductive labor of women, normally precarious women, racialized women. And so these bring us to two central conversations. One that is focused on understanding or redefining what we mean by labor and what we understand by workers, and which labor and which workers are considered worth protecting in just transitions. Because the system remains structurally unjust upon cheap, precarious, and exploited reproductive labor in both hubs. And this brings us to two crucial implications for just transition. As I said, redefining what we mean by labor and who counts as a worker, including those whose reproductive labor maintains labor power. And the second and most important implication is it has structural implications. And basically what we claim, and with this I will finish, is that justice is a transformative demand that requires systemic restructuring of how reproductive labor is organized and valued. And a just transition is impossible under capitalism, and because it structurally requires reproductive labor exploitation across transnational commodity chains. With that, I'll finish now. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Vela. That was really thought-provoking, especially for me, because I'm not often exposed to some of these frameworks and analysis. So that was really great. Are there any questions from the floor? I think I'll do a round of taking questions from the floor and then questions from online. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Diana, and to all of the speakers. I think this was quite a useful presentation. One in part of introducing some people to the concepts that others have been working on, but also in a way showing how we can kind of operationalize social reproduction and feminist approaches in kind of development research. And I think that's been quite useful. I think the last point though that you made about how a just transition is impossible under capitalism really kind of struck something. And I think the question that I have is really based on that then, about the broader project and the intentions and the vision for this kind of ACACIA project that you're all embarking on, is maybe a point to clarify what the intentions of the project are and the parameters of innovation that you touched on earlier, I think, Chevonne, speaking specifically to this question of, the inability to care. Noting what Diana just mentioned at the end there, and how basically capitalism as a system restructures the relations of production and reproduction in society. What is this project then trying to do in terms of the innovation behind that? And I think Anthony had mentioned something about trying to draw specifically communities in to speak on questions of vulnerability. But in the context of developing countries in the global south, how does this project aim to incorporate communities beyond just issues of vulnerability? And I think this is important because you mentioned our inability to care, but we also know that there are ways that communities have been organizing resources, have been engaging with nature in caring ways. So how do you define that? But also how do you include that in this project going forward? But also because we've just seen a presentation on social reproduction theory that really speaks to the relation of essentially reproduction subsidizing production, but also there's been criticism of SRT. Some scholars, particularly Sarisha Naidu, has talked about circuits of reproduction, where we are forced to engage with the reality that in many countries where people are unemployed, most people are not directly, able to kind of have this, a flow of reproduction in the sense of, or at least with the ultimate goal of contributing to this productive economy. How do you then produce innovative policies that engage with that maybe, for the most part, communities are doing this work for the sake of reproduction in and of itself, and not necessarily with the outcome of it contributing to capitalist development? And what do policies that look like and innovation look like from that perspective? Or at least what the project to do. Yeah.
Do you want the speaker to address those points, or?
I think it's to the broader context. I think the speaker did a great job.
Let's have Diana's thoughts first.
My God, that is a very complicated, and I think probably a lot of these reflections should come from a lot of the people that are joining from all of us. I think these are important reflections, also what it means for this hub, right, as well. I'll just say, and I'll really curious about what the others think, but one of the problems that I've been thinking about, right, considering the framework of like denouncing the labor exploitation that happens through reproductive labor, then it is not enough to say, okay, we recognize this labor, right? Or we paid for this labor, because it still is maintained through several systems of exploitation, right? So it is still within a specific system that extracts surplus labor and exploits labor and damages the social reproduction conditions of the places where these industries happens, right? My point is that then we really need to think about how we prefigured conditions in which social reproduction and reproductive labor actually allows us to imagine different conditions under which energy systems can take place. So that's why, like, for example, when there was the initial presentation, I'm very curious to hear more on how we can reimagine what you were talking about, the care financing, to think about this nexus between climate and care and what it means to break away from these patterns in which we basically are supporting otherwise inequality, gender-based inequalities and violences. But I'm more curious to hear from others on this.
Okay. Do you want to share something?
I think Tangena, I think does raise important kind of questions about the possibilities for a kind of a just transition within the current economic framework. I think it would be fair to say for this project, we don't foresee a kind of transition happening outside of a kind of economic framework that is essentially a capitalist kind of framework, and there is no objective within this project to kind of overthrow a capitalist system. Having said that, though, we do within this project want to provide evidence, and I think our intentions around the financing elements and the finance part of the project 1, 2. We do have the objective of wanting to reshape some of the kind of economics of how we would kind of evaluate a climate transition and how we would evaluate what it would mean to have a just transition. So that's certainly part of our kind of objective, and I don't think we would have any fundamental disagreement with the points that Diana has raised. I think our objectives are just more kind of immediate and not intending to raise some of the larger questions.
It's just to speak to the point you brought up about like communities and caring for nature. Like that's one of the biggest reasons why I think that the care climate nexus and the work and the evidence that we're trying to collect is so important, because we're talking about 75% of land cover in Africa is these near natural rangelands that are kept near natural by people and by indigenous practices and knowledge and like systems that have been put in place and are held in place by like local governance and rules and sharing and communities coming together. And I think like really highlighting that, and particularly as a form of like communities' own climate resilience and work that should be rewarded and not just thought of as like, oh well, this is just what people do to maintain their livelihoods. It's like these communities are doing incredibly important work in keeping carbon in the ground or bringing carbon into the ground, and that isn't even being recognized in any of the sort of climate financing that's happening. So really trying to highlight that, and especially in financial mechanisms to say, well, there's work that goes into getting that carbon into the ground, and that carbon in the ground that we're pulling out of the atmosphere is because of the work that people are doing in these near natural systems. So, okay, great. There's a question online. Yael, sorry, I'm reading from a distance. Yael Shalem, and then we'll come back to the room. Would you like to ask your question? Was it in the chat? You should be able to unmute. Okay, let's take a question from.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
First, I really want to thank you for the excellent presentation. It was really, really so clear to follow the chain of reproduction and explanation in the name of just transition. I mean, the conflict and the anomaly is unbelievable. What I want to push you a little bit more is, you say that despite the systems being, and you link all of that to capitalism, right? Now, you say that Chile and Sweden are two different systems because of the welfare system in Sweden, and despite of that, you see such level of similarity. But I want to push you on whether there are any differences. Does welfare not make any difference? I mean, does it have no interruptive power to the social reproduction in Sweden in compared to Chile? I mean, have we lost hope in welfare as well? That's my question. How does the welfare system come into play, and does it have any power to interrupt this chain of exploitation? Thank you. Really, thank you for an excellent presentation.
Yeah, I can briefly answer that. Thank you so much, Yael. I'm happy that you enjoy. And yeah, no, so no, I didn't mean to say that. Yeah, we shouldn't push and think about the importance of welfare. So the main point was actually to point out the racialized differences where you come to implement welfare states, right? So it works and most likely work for Swedish citizens, but in the case of migrants, where there is the paperwork application for different labor conditions that are treated as second-class citizens. So when it comes to migrants trying to find job positions, and especially migrants that are not being able to integrate because of language differences, of cultural differences, there is a lot of gaps in the integration programs and welfare provisionings that are coming from the state. So it is not about talking of the lack of services or it shouldn't work. It's just actually pointing at the racialized differences in terms of welfare and who receives what type of programs.
So theoretically, it could have made a difference if it wasn't the difference between the provision of welfare between citizens and migrants and immigrants. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, could be. But I don't think we had any case of Swedish that we interview in case of Swedish citizens that were working for this type of industry. So in the case of Norrbol, we focuses on workers that were working for the subcontracted companies, and most of them were actually migrants.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. There was a question there, and then.
Thank you so much. I think my question was actually asked in relation to the welfare, but towards your sentiments in the opening, just wanted to ask, how do you then see, the current the care credits? You see it as integral for climate finance, because it can be argued that mitigation can also serve to cater for social protection under climate finance. So do you see it as a standalone or a levy that should be then taken out of climate finance in time? Thank you.
I actually don't know the answer to that because I'm not an economist. I also work in finance. I think part of what we might really want to do there is try and understand the landscape at both adaptation and mitigation, and how is it all flowing? What is what is rewarded, what is not rewarded, and how do all these credits work? And also importantly, I think Sonia raises this point. So which mechanisms, I guess, in both adaptation and mitigation are a bit to like Diana's presentation, are actually exploitative and not necessarily don't really necessarily fit within the sort of feminist economics frameworks. And so then we create care credits using a financial mechanism that actually is exploiting somebody down the line. So a lot of that work is going to be very exploratory, trying to actually map the space. But the eventual hope that we can design something, or at least start thinking about something that's can be.
Thank you, Diana, for the presentation, and especially the kind of typologies at the end, which give us the different chains that you call them. But I think back to the previous question for now. So if you have to mediate the care across all of that gender, racialized class divisions, what did the people in the study, how do you then, what sort of care would work for them? If they're within a welfare system that offers it, but only to people with formal papers, what would care look like for someone who is facing so many language barriers, is working for someone who after 5 months will, keep them up? What sort of solutions then, and where does intervention come? Because that could be useful in so many other societies within the global south that are faced with similar kinds of barriers to people participating in the kinds of labor markets. Yeah. What would help them? Do they say that? What did they say would help them? Not what we think the intervention would be, or what would help them?
Yeah, no, thank you. This is such an important question, definitely. And so we initially, when are in the first fieldwork phase, we were trying to explore and talk with the workers on what is their labor conditions. And now we want to plan a second phase of fieldwork, which actually focuses on asking that question: what it will mean then to implement and to focus on social reproduction, or focus on care, or focus on like really raising the decent living conditions of these workers. What would it mean for them? And focusing on working, for example, with labor unions as well. I know that is something that right now I'm afraid that I cannot answer, but that is something that is in our mind, and I think this is such an important conversation. So, for example, Estefania Barca recently published a report actually responding to that question, right? So, what would feminist just transition mean coming from the workers? And they asked this question to different sectors, right? I think there is healthcare, there is energy, there is I'm missing all the sectors, but that is an important conversation, and of course needs to be raised because otherwise we're just not responding to the specific demands. What is very concerning is when you talk about the aspirations of many of the people that we talk to, they will for example, in the case of Carmen, their aspirations is actually be recruited to work as a subcontracted worker, right? So she would like to work in Sodexo, for example, because at least that provides minimum guarantees in terms of securing wage on a monthly basis, securing a relatively permanent positioning without risking a lot of the conditions that she currently faces. So that is an important provocation, right? Is in such precarious conditions of the people, then securing even a little bit more conditions to prevent or secure access to resources, to life, to wage. Because of their lives are so precarious, even securing a little bit of better working conditions is aspirational for them. But I think the conversation really needs to be pushed farther away.
Are there any more questions online? Perhaps in the chats? Can you check the chats?
No, nothing.
Nothing. And then there's
Yes, sorry, just the question just brought something up because you were talking about different workers might have different demands, but you're also looking at a specific sector, correct? And I believe the extent to which you kind of engaged with issues around informal work was also to this question either on unpaid care or in some kind of low-paid work, and how that might then subsidize a higher earning jobs, even though precarious within the formal sector. But do you, or at least is the project interested more broadly, because I understand the study had a specific scope and focus, but is this project then also interested in other sectors beyond this? Because when you're talking about issues of just transition, and even just on issues around climate in general, oftentimes the informal sector is left out of this. when we know that there are specific sectors within the informal sector that are directly engaged, not even on a kind of reproductive, subsidizing the productive side, whether it's kind of waste picking, where there's certain kind of sectors as well that are in some ways working within that sector that are not accounted for. We also know that there's a lot of policies and how the circular economy itself is also being kind of co-opted by this, kind of bigger corporate jobs with no support. So are you interested in this project and engaging with us, and in what ways? Because I assume there would be different demands as well from those workers in terms of what kind of support might be required and how then we think about financing from that side. Understanding that these workers might also be migrants, might not have entitlements within kind of this even legal framework and economic framework of our governments, and somehow are left out, whether through tax policies or penalized through tax policies. So how do we then think about those, from the broader, sorry, Chevonne, you're now going to be the spokesperson for the project. But yeah.
Sorry, just to follow you through, so your question will be,
are you thinking about informality outside of just from the kind of unpaid reproductive? I see Julia is ready to respond. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is really challenging questions, right? So I'm not necessarily all the answers on this, and we're starting to think about this. But definitely, I mean, for me, as a personal level, that is the biggest challenge that I have, right? Not only theoretically, but in practice, what this means. Like, if we actually are able to question and criticize how the system is working, then how do we actually push in certain conditions and reimagine the conditions that take into consideration also the aspects of informality that is so prevalent in our countries, right? And right now, I don't have a specific answer, and I think there needs to be a lot of social and collective intelligentsia to think about that, definitely. And I think, as just to go back to the previous comment, it really needs to come a lot from the people that are experiencing this dynamics. Yeah, sorry, no, yeah, perhaps it is a vague answer.
Julia?
Hi, Diana. It's so nice to see you again, and thank you so much for the presentation. Yeah, I wanted to share a little bit on some of our thinking on the Care Climate Hub. So we're really trying to start a process of thinking about these issues. So yeah, I think all of the ideas around, focusing on informality are going to be incorporated. And we don't necessarily have the answers at this point because it's just the first kind of few months of the project. But this has been a really, really valuable session to start us off. I think, Diana's kind of framework has given us a lot to think about, I think, in terms of how we understand care work as it relates to climate change. And one of the things we're really wanting to do is quantify the value of care work in climate resilience. So not only kind of how care workers in the healthcare sector, for example, are supporting communities when there's a climate shock, but also how people working in even kind of infrastructure and kind of water conservation, all of these kinds of work are often not seen as that valuable. But as they relate to climate resilience, they have, significant value, and also kind of what are the different inequalities that shape these kinds of labor structures in East and Southern Africa. So yeah, I think it's all really exciting ideas, and I'm really looking forward to exploring it all. So thank you so much.
Part of the launch of the project and already kicking off the seminar series, I think was an excellent start. And thank you to all the attendees online. Really appreciate support and for coming and listening to Deanna's wonderful seminar.